Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Bipartisan Children's Caucus webinar. We're so happy to have some expert panelists joining us to talk about making sure that women and their children are part of the conversation here in Ohio when it comes to policy planning and legislation. So to start us off, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of how we're framing the discussion. The COVID-19 economic recession, as many of you have probably heard, was referred to many times as a she-cession. The disproportionate impact women have shouldered has been more profound than during any other economic downturn in our nation's history. And the past 2 years alone have reversed decades of progress that women have made to reduce gaps in pay, employment, and workforce participation. In 2019, women made up nearly half, or 48% of Ohio's workforce. Further, in 2/3 of all Ohio households, women were the sole, primary, or co-breadwinners for their families, with 85% of Black mothers, 62% of Latina mothers, and 53% of white mothers taking on the role as key breadwinner. During the pandemic, however, women were more likely to be laid off or forced to leave their jobs. In fact, 1.1 million women across the country have left the labor force since February of 2020. And while men have now recouped their pandemic-related job losses, women have not, especially Black women, the only demographic group whose unemployment rate has actually risen in 2022. Too many mothers were driven out of the workforce well before the pandemic due to the lack of paid parental leave and affordable, accessible childcare. But it was the absence of a robust caregiver infrastructure, along with emergent challenges of the pandemic, such as the lack of workplace flexibilities that women in essential but poorly paid and undervalued sectors faced, which thrust many families into even greater economic difficulties than before. And as stated by one American sociologist, other countries have safety nets. In the United States, we have mothers. So please join us during this conversation. We're doing it very intentionally during Women's History Month to make sure that we are focusing on all of the contributions that women make, and especially during the pandemic in ways that are often unpaid and unrecognized, and how we can do more to support them. We have a few speakers, and what I'd love to do now is turn this discussion over to our first speaker, Kelly Griezmir, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the president and CEO of the Women's Fund of Central Ohio. Kelly, we'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I will try to keep this quick because I know we have so many great colleagues of mine who are going to speak today as well. At the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, our goal is to transform the lives of women and girls through the collective power and passion of all people working together. And one of the main ways that we've been focusing on transforming those lives in recent years has been to look at the wealth gap, the gender and racial wealth gap for women, not just the wage gap. Although the wage gap is a very important piece of the wealth gap. But what we saw when we did this research in 2019 was that barely a year after the report we commissioned was released, that wealth gap became a full-fledged she-cession, as we have described. So next slide. So we commissioned this report in 2019, and as I said, it was somewhat remarkable that it became the foundation of what we were going to be talking about during the pandemic. Next slide. We looked first at, when you look at earnings, we wanted to compare Central Ohio, which is where we focus most, but really this is representative of a lot of Ohio, to what we see nationally. And this is just a quick graphic that shows you what women earn, their annual earnings nationally. And what you can see is that there is a range, and none of them are at 100% dollar for dollar earning. And in fact, when you get to Black women and Latina women, it gets closer to only half. Next slide. In Ohio, it's very similar. These numbers, they may vary a little, but you can see the same disparities for Central Ohio in 2019 when it came to wages. Next slide. So what we want people to understand, though, is that wages do not equate to wealth. How much a woman earns is indeed a one spoke in the wheel of why women do or do not accumulate wealth. But we could fix the wage gap tomorrow and it would not come close to fixing the wealth gap. And that's because of many of the issues that the representative discussed in this introduction. There are many, many things that impact wealth other than wage, such as, and especially caregiving responsibilities that gender norms and implicit biases throughout our history have determined that women will bear the weight of all caregiving, that family growth is encouraged, but we don't have any support system, no care economy for those people who are also working to make our economy stronger and yet still have to carry out those caregiving responsibilities. Next slide. What that means, that translates to, is nationally, when you compare single women to single men, and the reason you compare single people is because when women are married, their wealth becomes almost invisible due to the way that we manage wealth in this country. But you can compare, we do have disaggregated data for single people, and single women, if there were such a thing as a composite woman, she owns 40 cents to the dollar, and that's owns, and this is in 2019. So that means that 60 cents of her wealth is going out the door for other things that she needs to take care of. And when you want, what's most important to the Women's Fund is that we look at this intersectionally. And then that means that we not only look at this gender issue, because we know there is no such thing as a composite woman, although you can determine what one might look like, and that's what this first stat indicates. But in the second and third stat is where things become very, very devastating. Because when you look at a gender and racial wealth gap, what we see is that Latina women owned 8 cents for every dollar that a man owned in 2019, and Black women owned only 2 cents. And that was before the pandemic. So there are wealth building barriers and there are wealth building accelerators. Anyone who looks at the slide, I've just highlighted the prime wealth building years for women, and that is 35 to 64. It's affordable housing, the availability of sick days and paid family leave, childcare, student loans, the way they're targeted for subprime loans, a lack of household savings, barriers to entrepreneurship. Those are all barriers, but you'll see that many of them could also become accelerators. Next slide. When you look at, if you flip some of these things on their head, when we have some of these policies, things that you all are working so hard on, things that we do have control over, the access to affordable quality childcare alone would change the wealth building of women. Next slide. So without wealth, women cannot weather a storm. And when I say wealth, I just mean the ability to weather a storm. I don't mean that they need to become rich, although we certainly would like them to become much wealthier than they are. But the storm of a century came with the pandemic. Next slide. And that's what we've been calling the She-cession, although it's hard to say. Next slide. And so what that meant was women were on the front lines. 67% of them were of all the over 1 million workers working on the front lines were women. 80% women were working in healthcare, 85% in childcare and social services, and more than half of the grocery, convenience, and drugstores that we all needed so desperately during the shutdown. Next slide. They were also overrepresented in the industries that lost the most workers: hospitality, childcare, leisure, retail. 55% of the jobs lost in April alone, April of 2020 alone, were held by women. And that set us back, starting in April of 2020, decades. There was the most women there had ever been in the workforce, and it has now dropped back to we have lost decades of progress. And women of color represented only 20% of the population, but they comprised 40% of childcare workers, who we know have been so important on both the front line and to keep the rest of us working. Next slide. So 60% of women are caregivers. They needed those women working in childcare because that's how they kept their jobs. 20% of women workers had no paid leave. So when you combine all these things, it means that 865,000 women, almost 1 million women, left the workforce in September 2020 alone, compared to only 262,000 16,000 men that was voluntarily left the workforce because schools had closed. And that's where we see that this childcare spoke, and not that schools are childcare. They are not. Those are two totally different things. But even when the schools closed, we had these women leave the workforce. Next slide. And so I would close by saying that in a recent Forbes article, what becomes most important for everyone to realize is that pandemics reinforced gender norms and gender roles. It was determined that we do not have a care economy. To the quote, the social safety net for the United States was women. Women, when the going got hard, either had to stay working in the most difficult industries while still caring for their families, or had to leave voluntarily. And it's statistically demonstrable that the women that have children are less likely to get hired because their hiring managers decide they're just going to leave or not be able to stay. And that even though we gain increases when the retail industries and the restaurant industries come back, the lucrative long-term positions are not going to women, even though they have shown and proven that they are good in those roles. So the she-cession isn't just lingering, it is getting worse because there's an ever widening chasm, and it will swallow women's progress if we don't start to bridge that gap. So to close on this quote, which is so important, and we all must remember this, other countries have social safety nets. The US has women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I was taking notes furiously. That data is just eye-opening. And I think it supports a lot of what many of us women saw in our social groups or experienced ourselves. And it's very helpful to see the hard data that proves what we have thought that we've been experiencing. So now we want to turn it over to Sandra Palavoda. Did I pronounce that correctly, Sandra?
You got it right.
And Sandra is with Team NEO, and that is part of the Jobs Ohio network. And Sandra, we'd love to hear you tell us about what you saw for women and mothers, or for women who had households with children over the past several months. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you so much. Again, my name is Sandra Palavoda, Manager of Research here at Team NEO. For those of you who aren't familiar, Team NEO is a network partner of Jobs Ohio, Ohio's statewide economic development organization dedicated to increasing innovation, job growth, new and continued investment in Ohio. So Team NEO does what Jobs Ohio does, but for the top right corner of Northeast Ohio's 18 counties. We focus on business, workforce, education, other economic trends, try and understand how our region can best tell a story of Northeast Ohio. Next slide. So we just heard a lot of statistics on Ohio's working women from Kelly, and I'll be diving into some similar statistics, but for Northeast Ohio's working women. This report, Lost Opportunities, the pandemic's impact on Northeast Ohio's working women, was born out of the countless headlines during lockdown around the state of workers, especially from the Bureau of Labor Statistics reporting of women's exodus from the workplace en masse. Next slide. We saw that depending on what industry or occupation you worked in when lockdown started, you could be exposed to the virus at your essential job, let go or furloughed and put in limbo, or switch to remote work. In Northeast Ohio, over 80% of our healthcare support workers are women, 75% in education, and 61% in food services. These top three sectors in the region with high rates of female employment accounted for more than 70,000 lost jobs around the pandemic. Next slide. For those with essential jobs and children at home, daycare options were limited if existent at all. Dependent on the age of your children also factored into whether or not you could continue to go to work. For those able to work from home with kids, parents had to navigate childcare and online school stressors daily, the work-home life lines becoming blurred. In Northeast Ohio, single mothers make up an estimated 6% of all households. Couples with children, which make up an estimated 17% of our households, experienced greater job and income losses than those with children who no longer lived at home. And of people who work and live below the poverty line in Northeast Ohio, over half of those workers are women. This is only a small look into the complexities of Northeast Ohio's female population. Next slide. In the data, we wanted to talk about the gender wage gap and saw that at every level of educational attainment, Northeast Ohio women were earning less than their male working counterparts. I know that Lisa will be reviewing this topic in depth soon, so I'll advance to my next slide. We did, however, look at the intersection of women's concentration in industry and the average salary for that job family. For example, women make up a little over 50% of sales and related jobs, but the median pay for those jobs is just around $30,000. Women make up less than 40% of management jobs, which pays a median wage upwards of $90,000. When we looked at this graph, we saw that more women were in jobs paying under $50,000 than paying higher wages. While we can't yet see a detailed look at the imbalance between men and women by specific jobs, this starts to give us a better idea on where we might want to encourage young women and girls to look at career options as they embark on their educational and professional careers. Next slide. Team NEO also works with colleges and universities to make sure they understand regional trends in 3 specific major industries in the region: manufacturing, IT, and healthcare. These are industries that bring investment into the region, offer a variety of career pathways, but also on average are industries with higher paying, higher responsibility, and challenging jobs. In Northeast Ohio, women make up a large amount of graduates in healthcare degrees. However, we know that the number of surgeons has a higher concentration of male workers. Manufacturing and IT graduates are likewise majority male. We included these figures to beg the question, are we helping our young students find pathways into these industries? And Team NEO's work around talent is aimed at helping students better visualize themselves in these fields and supports organization and programming that does the same. Next slide. We also looked to see what data was available on the number of women in business. Nationally, women-owned businesses represented 42% of all business, employing 9.4 million workers and generating $1.9 trillion in revenue. Half of these women-owned businesses nationally were in the beauty, care, and professional services industries, many of which were heavily impacted by the pandemic. Women continued to be underrepresented in technology and manufacturing business ownership. Regional business data in Northeast Ohio shows that that numbers of female-owned businesses are much lower than male-owned. Industries with a high concentration of female-owned businesses saw 35,000 jobs lost during the pandemic. So we also hope that data available in the future shows us how these industries have rebounded since 2020. Next slide. I want to end here on a couple of slides around the work already being done in Northeast Ohio. Girl Scouts of Northeast Ohio offers a STEM badge to help introduce and encourage young girls into the STEM field. Tri-C's Women in Transition program provides wraparound services, including mental health and financial counseling, to help women remain in their programs of choice and graduate on time. The YWCA of Greater Cleveland identified years ago the need to increase their minimum wage to $15 an hour, staying true financially to their commitment to equity, and during the pandemic, lifted paid time off restrictions to provide their staff with more flexibility. When we spoke with these companies and institutions, a common theme emerged. And at the top of their organization, they led with empathy and vision. This led to more advancement opportunities and retention of their talent overall. Next slide. I'll leave you with one of Team NEO's guiding principles, generational opportunity. This idea helps us find businesses to stay and grow in the region and grow our residents and workforce, like how Intel's new manufacturing plant near Columbus will impact Ohio and the nation for our generations and the ones in the future. Generational opportunity also refers to industries handing over the reins to future generations. To try and bridge the gap between generations, men and women, employers and employees, Team NEO and our partners have been conducting roundtables around a new study called Where Are the Workers? To bridge this gap between employers and employees specifically as a result of COVID strain on the workforce. We are seeing a shift in how workers are valued from a company's perspective. Instead of companies thinking, well, there's always somebody else willing to do this job, employers are thinking about how better to attract, retain, and invest in new and existing employees. Some of the recommendations coming out of these roundtables, which have a direct impact on women in the workplace, and out of discussions with businesses from the Lost Opportunities Report, will only be applicable to large businesses, but some, especially cultural, can be done by any size company. Identify ways that minorities and women are being deterred or overlooked from management and other advanced positions. on-the-job training in literacy and mathematics, not just training a new employee about how things are done, but literally how to do them, providing transparency in pay and benefits, changing that culture around silence, stopping the penalization of motherhood and fatherhood and providing better maternal and paternal leave, find ways to decrease the cost of going to work through better transportation options, statewide, metro-wide, and locally, to connect jobs in the suburbs to jobs in the urban core and vice versa. And finally, parents needing affordable, stable childcare options that they can access using that transportation, offering childcare or subsidizing daycare, remote, hybrid, or non-traditional scheduling options that provide mothers and fathers with the flexibility they need. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Next, we're going to hear from Lisa Pat Mcdaniel, the CEO of Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio. Lisa, please jump in and share some information with us. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Representative Smith. And I also want to do a shout out to my senator, Senator Stephanie Kunze. So thank you for having us here. So the Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio, we are the workforce area that covers Franklin County. What we are in the business of is helping job seekers acquire the credentials and skills they need to obtain employment in household sustaining, with household sustaining wages, and to help employers develop a talent pipeline so that they thrive in the Central Ohio economy. I wish I could give you a report that we're working on right now. I'm going to give a shout out to it, but it will be coming out more in May. We were funded by the Franklin County Commissioners to do a Women at Work initiative. And the point of that initiative is to understand why women who were working as of February of 2020 have been unable to come back into the workforce or are underemployed. And so we are just finishing up our focus groups and survey research. And so we will have that data available for everybody coming up, as I said, at the beginning of May. And I'm probably going to refer to some of the nuggets that we're learning. So that's who we are. We can talk about this topic all day. I know that. So I'm just going to highlight just a few bullets to illustrate the economics of the gender gap. You've already heard a lot from both Kelly and Sandra. But the first thing I want to leave you with is, or start out with is, we cannot succeed when half of us are held back. And the half we're talking about are us, the female part of the population. Next slide. Okay, so here's the first fact I want to share with you. If the employed women in Ohio were paid the same as comparable men to them, their poverty rate would be reduced by nearly half. And poverty among employed single mothers would drop by 2/5. Now, this number comes to us from 2016. So there likely are numbers that would be updated here, but it's still going to be very similar. So that to me is an incredible eye-opening data point. You've already seen some of this, but it bears repeating. If you go to the next slide, if we look at what the actual wages are for women, and we compare them to men of the same background. So for example, taking Asian women, comparing them to Asian men, and then you compare them against white men, you can see what the difference is in wages. You can see, for example, that Black women have an average wage of $41,098, but when you compare them to white men, it's 63%. So it's comparable to what Kelly showed you at the beginning. The numbers may not be exactly the same, but we're both pulling, I think, from the Institute for Women's Policy Research. So these numbers, I believe, are from 2019, right before the pandemic. So you can see that it is very interesting that at this point in our time, next slide, you would think by now women would be paid the same as men. And that's definitely not the case. According to the Institute for Women's Policy Research, if the pace of change in the annual earnings ratio, meaning how much women are making compared to men, continues at the same rate as it has since 1960, it will take another 39 years. 39 years. I don't even know if I'll be alive in 39 years. For men and women to reach parity in wage. That is amazing. I'm going to take a guess that all of us have been in the workforce or started in the workforce since 1979, when we really started to see women participate at greater and greater rates. So that can be very disheartening. But I know that's what we're here to solve. So the next slide. So what are the contributing factors to the gender wage gap? You've already heard both Kelly and Sandra point some of those off. We know that millions of workers were laid off during the coronavirus recession. Many are only now beginning to return, but we also know that millions more are experiencing serious workplace disruptions. And a lot of that still is focused on women workers and workers of color who unfortunately have bared the brunt of the pandemic disruption. But there are other contributing factors that were happening before the pandemic. Gender segregations in industries and occupations, which Sandra just referred to. So the fact that as some industries and occupations become more and more occupied by women, the wages go down, and then men leave those occupations, causing wage pressure to go down further. We know that access to affordable education and training for women, and especially women of color, women from marginalized demographics. If you don't have the right credentials, if you can't go to college, if it's difficult for you to join the apprenticeships or construction where people can quickly make a lot of money, you're not going to be able to make the same wage as men. Also, an over-reliance on college degrees. We know that this is something we're working with constantly with employers. They're requiring college degrees when the fact is many of these jobs don't really require a college degree. And so that's going to further depress women who aren't able to get a college degree to move into those positions that pay a higher wage. I already talked about it. The burden of care primarily falls to women. That's whether you're a single mom or you're married to a man. So, and when I talk about the burden of care, I'm not just talking about children. I am talking about elder care as well. So women usually are primarily responsible for taking care of their elder parents or other elder relatives. And even if they are not responsible for the day-to-day care, they're primarily responsible for arranging for that care and stepping in when things fall apart. So I want to point that out because we've already talked about childcare, and we often forget that there is also that elder care piece. And then again, and I know this has been said, I think Kelly already pointed to this, discrimination, structural racism, and sexism affect women still, and especially women who are women of color and from other marginalized populations. So we know, and certainly there has been a lot of focus on DEIA, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. But with that focus doesn't necessarily mean that every employer's culture from top to bottom has completely changed. And that takes a lot of hard work. Just hiring a director of DEIA does not solve the problem of those who are doing the hiring in an organization, where people are sourcing their talent pool, what they're looking at as far as skills. Are they looking at what a skill a woman has and how it could be transferable to the skills an employer is looking at or looking for? So all of these things continue to contribute to the gender wage gap. Next slide. So, I just want to highlight some of these economic effects of being paid less. So as women came more and more into the paid workforce, because they were working before, they just weren't paid for it for a period of time in our history, they accounted for an additional 11% in the United States GDP. And that number is likely higher from when I pulled it in the mid-2010s. So women are the main source of income, or the co-source of income, for 2/3 of the families in the United States. The US needs, working women have made the difference in family economic security for the last 5 decades. So many families need, even if they're in a 2-parent household, they need women to work in order for that family to entirely have economic security. And although the US desperately needs women to be in the workforce, here in Central Ohio, there are more jobs than there are people. For the jobs that we have, the caregiving structure has not kept up to support women working. So as you can, if you have these economic facts, you look at these other, less labor participation by women is bad for the overall GDP of the United States. Families suffer from not being able to buy basic necessities, housing, food, clothing, medical services, let alone the discretionary goods. We aren't doing trips to Easton. We're talking about basic necessities. And there's decreased economic security affects children's ability to thrive and learn when they go to school. Next slide. So policy solutions, I'm going to guess we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about these things, but we need to increase support for women in STEM and women participating in things like apprenticeships and other earn and learn models. Because number one, that'll fight occupation segregation. It also allows women to acquire the skills that they need to advance in the workplace while they're being paid. That's what apprenticeships and informal apprenticeships do. We need to increase support for affordable post-secondary education and training, certainly college and community college, but there are a lot of other institutions and training that are not necessarily tied to 4-year and 2-year college institutions. There are the opportunity to get an LPN, for example. There's career tech schools who do that. There are lots of other certifications that would allow a woman to advance in her career. And so we need to look at that more broadly. If you're looking at the federal level, Pell Grants are a primary way to pay for education and training. Currently, they just allowed Pell Grants to pay for short-term training, although that is under reconsideration right now in Congress. So whatever the state does, we need to consider providing that assistance for short-term credentials that may or may not be offered at the college or the community college. We need to increase quality child and elder care options. We need to increase support to companies so that they offer things like job sharing and flexible work for women and men, and that was also already brought up. Address structural discrimination by shining light on organizations and companies where true equitable inclusion is working. And this is really important because I think many companies want to do this in smaller businesses, but they don't have really good models for doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I want to give us the opportunity to have the conversation about policy models out there. I do want to throw your attention to what Franklin County just announced last week. They are taking their ARPA money. They are making $10,000 scholarships available to low-income families to pay towards childcare directly. They're giving $3,000 to providers to take on serving low-income families for childcare. And they're also giving providers up to $5,000 to expand their hours of childcare. Right there is something they're doing with ARPA funds, but something we should look at doing across the state in a way that isn't just when we get an infusion of money. So I'll stop there though and let you all take it on to questions.
Thank you so much. Just so much helpful information that allows us to sort of understand and quantify in very tangible terms, what the barriers are for the primary caregivers in our society, which are still women. And it was very helpful also, Lisa, to hear you say very clearly that in Ohio, we need women in the workforce. And so we need to provide better caregiving policies and support in order to make that happen, to remind us that there are more jobs than workers oftentimes, and women help to address that workforce need. It reminds us that we as a state can do more to help women get back into the workforce, especially following the pandemic, and then thereby help more families receive the income that they need to survive. And so what I'd love to do is two things. I want to just do a little quick shout out to Senator Kunze. And Senator, I just want to give you the opportunity without putting you on the spot and just give you the opportunity to chime in if there are some specific policy, solutions or ideas or just thoughts that you're having as you hear all this. I want to make sure that you're able to jump in and take some time to talk about those things. But also, if you need a minute, I can do some Q&A first.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Rep. Smith. You did a great job kicking us off. And I think actually I'm supposed to lead this section of the discussion. So I will just take it from here if you want, but Thanks. I know we have some legislators that are on the call, and I know I will circle back to you in case you have specific questions for our great panelists. Kelly, it's great to see you. Sandra, thank you so much. And Lisa, always a pleasure to be with you. I took some good notes. They're very, I should have probably had a larger piece of paper. But I don't know if we have any questions in the chat. I don't see anything yet, but Allison, if you see something pop up, please let me know right away. I don't know if any of the representatives or senators that are on the call want to ask a question first. Otherwise, I will jump in with a couple of thoughts and questions that I did take notes on. Okay, seeing none yet. I was thinking back to a conversation that Kelly and I had on a Zoom call maybe late 2020. I will say my time frame since COVID, I just say recently a lot because it's hard to remember exactly what point we had discussions, but I know that we talked about at the beginning of the She-cession, we were starting to see it. And we also started to see the impact. Again, I'm glad Lisa brought up not only elderly care, but the child care issues. And we had a lot of conversations. And so this is kind of a question maybe for all three of you, if you want to comment. I had been urging, and I know others on several calls have been urging our corporate partners and our businesses. I know Lisa touched on small business and that struggle, maybe with flexibility, but I had been talking about One Columbus, which is the partner, sister partner, for lack of a better term, for NEO. I know Women's Fund here in Central Ohio works very closely, and Lisa, you do as well. And so are we seeing, my thought at the time, like a year and a half ago or so, and in several conversations since, has been, what can we do? Obviously, it's going to be a partnership, right? It's going to be partly on I think, I can't remember, was it one of you said, I think it was Sandra, that where you saw success was empathy and vision of leadership. So what else can we do? Some of that's going to be a private business, a corporate partner encouragement, but what else can we do as partners in government to maybe showcase where companies have done a great job of allowing the flexible work schedule for both men and women, for taking some of the negative effects of COVID, where we saw, the work from home models in some ways it was good, in some ways it was hard. We, with childcare, lack of those kinds of things. I guess I'm going to stop babbling, but I think you get where I'm going. Where have we seen improvements, and who's doing a great job with some of those things? And where else can we, as your partners, maybe enact policy on the government side, or even continue to bring up those conversations when we meet with our corporate leaders and our corporate partners?
Well, I can add that I think the most important thing, I think we did gain a lot of empathy during the pandemic, and that for the first time, men, brothers, uncles, grandfathers had to support their families, both children, teens, and elder care in a different way. And I always say, I hope that's not forgotten. We all get comfortable very quickly. You'll hear a lot of people complaining right now, well, we got to get back to the office. We have to, but I think we really have to ask ourselves, do we? Yes, all businesses will thrive when people have great connection. And I believe very much in human connection. But I do think the days of 9 to 5 or 8 to 5, to the mandatory happy hour after work, to the mandatory 3-day retreat, where, it's not going to work for families, period. People have not returned to work. And so for me, it is at least empathy. And for others, it's an intentional accountability for the fact that we now know work got done, and a lot of people did make money during the pandemic, and the market worked just fine. And so can we own up to that? And I think the number one thing we have to remember is that we cannot start off with the bias that women are not seeking the right careers, that they're not getting the right educations. As I said, in that wealth thing, there are women who will go to school for years to try to be perfect for a role, and all they end up with is a lot of student aid and a lot of student loans, and people still not giving them the opportunity to work. So I do want to encourage, we can give scholarships, we can do all these things, but to the point that Lisa raised, actually helping them with childcare and making sure that they do have a support system, that this is a care economy, is what we need to be focusing on. They're not missing opportunities. They're trying their hardest, and actually in some cases digging a hole that the economy is not letting them out of. And we have to be accountable for that.
I think the other thing that I would say, on the employer side, when employers look at their benefits, they need to start thinking about what are the benefits that are really going to help and keep my employees. And, a benefit of helping to pay for childcare is something that I think our employers should consider. Some of our large employers have helped put childcare on site. Nationwide Insurance has a childcare facility right on site. Things like that are really helpful, but not everybody's working at Nationwide Insurance, a large corporation, who can afford to do that. And so we have to look at ways that we can, smaller companies maybe can band together to look at who are the childcare providers within, their sphere, 5 miles, and how could they band together to work with those childcare providers? And it's creativity. I mean, we're a smart nation. We've come up with a lot of cool stuff. We can do it again if we just think outside the box about how we can provide. If we want people working for us, and we want the best working for us, then we've got to get creative in how we provide these things.
Just to end, or reiterate the business side of this. Recently, I heard from a company who had stressed that they took things by a case-by-case basis. They didn't really put a blanket company policy out there. They worked to retain the people that they wanted, and to make sure that they weren't going to lose people with a future expansion that they were thinking about. They said, come to us directly and we will work with you and figure out what the best course of action is. But from a policy lens, I do think that we saw a really big impact to public transportation during the pandemic, with the people needing to get to work through public transportation still via their essential jobs. And while some research that we've done, we've seen that Northeast Ohio and our metro areas do have affordable options, or affordable, monthly passes. I think there's more to be done for where public transportation is supported in going and expanding.
Sandra, I feel like, are you saying that because I'm the Senate Transportation Chair and you're singing to me, like singing my song that I love to talk about at the State Senate, talking about, how do we do that last mile connectivity? How else can we get creative? It's such an economic barrier for not only getting to jobs, but to healthcare, obviously the childcare options, all of the things that we are talking about here. I am going to look and check the chat, which is hard for me to see what questions are in here, if any. There is one question. Is there any discussion among policymakers about how state tax credits, like a refundable earned income tax credit or even a state child tax credit, can help address wealth gaps among women? Is there anyone on the panel who can shed light on this and how it might be a good policy option for greater economic stability for families? I will say we have done an earned income tax credit in the last budget, I believe. Again, budgets are running together. But if one of the panelists wants to talk about some of the things that the state could do in regards to that question, I know our Children's Caucus staff could also get the information about what the state has done in the past to our list of distribution list.
Yeah, well, there's actually a number of recommendations in that wealth gap report from 2019. And as I said, even though that information got sidelined for a little while due to just sheer panic, there's a lot in there that we were recommending at the time. And these are the kinds of things that absolutely help. I mean, think about this. This is when we talk about the benefits cliff or the benefits canyon. It's that as women start to accumulate wealth, if they don't have some of the support system like tax breaks or student loan forgiveness or some of these things that we feel people think like, oh, it's not fair, but really, actually, it's an accelerator for them that will accelerate our entire economy. This is about it being for all. And there was even a question I saw in the chat about taxes on feminine products and diapers. Think how many women are actually buying those products because they need them for actual, things that just happen with human life. And yet we, by taxing them, they're bearing the majority of that tax. And so small things like that can be a huge help to wealth building strategies.
So I'm proud to say I did have a bill. We don't tax feminine products in the state of Ohio for several years now. So that I can check off the list. We have had a couple of diaper legislation, Senator Maharath and myself in the Senate. Those, I don't think we have passed some of the diaper initiatives, but again, I'm sure that the Children's Caucus staff can give us an update on, or my legislative staff can give us updates on where some of that legislation stands. Anyone else want to talk about some of the state income tax credits, earned income tax credit? Lisa, you're shaking your head. Maybe you want to tell us a little bit more too about the RISE program. I'm glad you mentioned the announcement that we just heard here in Franklin County with the ARPA dollars. And I don't want to discount, obviously the state needs to have an influx and really a commitment. We've seen it with quality early childhood care. I serve as infant mortality commission. I mean, pre-birth to 5, pre-birth to 3 is so critical. And so I know that the state needs to, I'm not discounting that, but I will say I'm really grateful to see our county here in Franklin taking an influx, kind of putting on my Senate transportation chair hat again. There are just some things, just like with infrastructure and roads and bridges and transportation issues, that getting an influx of money from the federal government really does help build a foundation that will last for generations and make an impact. And so using some of that federal money to build a system and then for the state to be able to come in and to continue to operate and maintain it, that's a conversation I think we really need to be having and could have with this bipartisan bicameral caucus that we're here to talk about.
Yeah, I would encourage you, right? You should always make good use of a crisis. And we've just been through a crisis. And so we have all this money coming down. And so what we've talked about here in Franklin County, and I was so, again, happy to see them do this for childcare, is what are the big sky things that we think, hey, maybe we should try this and see if what effect it will have. And so putting this kind of investment, and I think it's like 14 million, I mean, it's a large amount of money out there, It's probably 1.4 now. I think about it, it's probably not 14. Maybe we all wish it was 14, but still a large amount to try this and see, does this work? And if this doesn't work, what could we do? Because it's not likely we will get this kind of money for another generation. At least we hope. I'll hope we don't. So what are the things we could do? You know, what are the things we could do around transportation? Actually, here CODA is trying very hard to provide the ability for people to ride the CODA buses at a reduced rate or no rate. But again, it's a spoke and wheel system in transportation, right? And so while it's one thing to help get people to their actual employment, they also have to get their child to child care. And so we have to really look, and that's why I think on businesses, they really need to look together so that a mother is bringing her child with her, is putting that child in daycare where they are working or in close proximity, because that would also help the transportation system. And then we do know there are, the earned income tax credit. There are HSAs where you can put aside money out to help, pre-tax. And a lot of people really don't know that. They don't understand they can do that. So therefore they don't have access to it because they're limiting themselves. And so there are a lot of things that people have access to that we need to make sure that they take advantage of those things. And so we need to do a better job of that as well. I'm reading.
Sandra, do you have anything to add on that?
I think Lisa and Kelly really,
Okay.
really
There's a question about childcare providers and the lack of staffing, the lack of pay to encourage people to want to go work. That is a concern. We actually have gone to several conferences through NCSL. It's not something that's unique to Ohio. Unfortunately, it's across our entire country. Even before the pandemic, we have been working, I think there's a lot of think tanks nationally that have been trying to address this issue about how do we, upscale, I guess, for lack of a better term, our early childhood and daycare, all of those from taking children from birth to 5, and even after school care. How do we encourage a higher pay and continue to provide quality childcare? That's just been exacerbated since COVID. And I don't know, Kelly, if you have any comments you want to make about some of the things that we've been seeing just across the board. Your 2019 study, I'm sure, showed the disparity in wages. If you think about, one of the ideas that I've heard is trying to, just like we have kindergarten teachers who have a degree and then a certain pay scale, how do we do that with the early childhood system as well? There's a lot of other ideas out there. I'll let the panelists comment on some of the things maybe that they're seeing and maybe a little bit more of an update since COVID.
The one thing I would share is that this childcare really is an industry where you have to think about the impact of gender norms and implicit biases since the time that industry began. And that is that women's unpaid labor has literally held up our economy. It used to be women stayed home and took care of children for free. And so when we've created an industry around caring for children, we still expect people to do it for free. And it really is, with great respect, an industry that, because it involves many women workers and even women owners, it's not invested in. It's not something that compensation is rewarded or training or, so it really is one of those things of wrapping around that industry, realizing that it is an economic driver for all of us. All of our businesses, all of our economy will do better. But we have to think about the fact that we have invested in that industry with very strong gender norms that say you do not invest in women, you do not pay them for this kind of work. And as long as there are mostly women, people see women women. It is an implicit bias, which means that we are blind to it. We drive and we stop at stoplights without thinking about it. We look at the childcare industry and think they make enough, it's too expensive, we can't invest in these kinds of things for this industry. It's something we all have to break. This isn't women versus men. This is women do it too. Everyone has to realize that we are applying that norm to this industry and we have to stop. And once we invest in it differently, it's not that hard to think about how we would fund it kind of courageously as we do many other nonprofit sectors that are traditionally more populated by those who identify as male.
Well,
And I would-
to
Go ahead, Sandra.
Thank you, Lisa. Just to Kelly's point, to Kelly's point, what we've heard is that the regulation that is needed for the daycare and childcare facility industries is a barrier for a lot of people to continue to keep up with the demand that they're facing, and also to keep up with the cost of actually keeping one of those facilities open. So if the regulation is hurting the industry at a time when it's already hurt, is there opportunity to help take away some of that pain on the regulation side?
Yeah, and I would also think we need to start looking at childcare as part of the infrastructure of nobody here would probably say we need to get rid of schools, public schools. We consider that a public good that absolutely has to be invested in. We know the amount of attention that the legislature has had to give to our public school system here in Ohio. And that's where our future workforce comes from. So let's just move that attention back a little bit, because the same way that we're investing in a public school system and consider that an infrastructure to the success of Ohio long-term, it's also looking at care for those, from 6 weeks, since usually somebody is staying home with their child until 6 weeks at least, at a minimum, all the way up until they start kindergarten. We have to look at that in the same way, kind of rethink everything to make that happen, which I know that's probably a crazy bold thing to say, but nonetheless, that's what it's going to take, in my opinion.
Yeah, new vision, I think
Right.
is a great way. And I'm looking at the clock and I know we are about 1 minute away from the end of our discussion. Are there any, Monique, Rep Smith, or Rep Richardson, is there anything you wanted to add before I close us out here before the 3 o'clock stop?
None
Thank you,
from me.
Senator, and thank you, Monique. I just wanted to say that I'm always excited to be part of this conversation. I worked as a human resources manager for a Fortune 500 company, and we've had this problem for many years. I'm ready to help move this forward and tackle some real challenges. I do think we have to partner with businesses very closely. The incentive is there for them. They understand their workforce shortages better than anyone. And I just wanted to weigh in and let you know that I'm super grateful for the presentation today. And thanks for the opportunity to say a few words.
Thanks, Rep Richardson. And thank you, Representative Smith. You kicked us off in a wonderful fashion. And thank you to all 3 of our panelists. Kelly, it's always a pleasure to work with you. I thank you for the work you do at the Women's Fund. Sandra, thank you for all that NEO's doing in partnership in our northeast portion of the state. And with Lisa, thank you for all of the work you're doing. We look forward to that report that's coming out in May. I'm hopeful you'll send that both to my office and we'll get it out through both myself and Rep Smith to the members of the Children's Caucus. We'll make sure that gets distributed. We'll be anxiously awaiting to see what that holds, and hopefully we'll have another discussion because we could have gone on a little bit longer, I think, on some of the policy actions, and hopefully it won't take 39 years to see this to fruition. So I echo Rep Richardson in my commitment to really bringing a new and exciting vision and a commitment, again, as we continue to look at what we can do, especially as we head into next year in the state budget, what kind of policies we can enact that will really help continue to lift Ohio's children and families and women, which we know are at the crux, as you said, of some of those child caring and economic decisions that really impact our state as a whole. So thank you all very much for joining us. That'll end the Children's Caucus for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.